Hello and welcome to Esri's 2020 User Conference and our discussion on GIS and Climate Resiliency. My name is Chris Chiappinelli. I'm editor of Esri's WhereNext magazine, and I'm joined by an impressive group of panelists for what I think will be a thought-provoking conversation. We're glad you could join us. So before I introduce our panelists, I just want to try to frame the discussion a bit. The COVID-19 pandemic has certainly focused the world's attention on the health risks that we all face. But I think lurking behind that is what may be one of the greater long-term threats we face, which is the changing climate and the risks that it will bring. So each of our panelists today has worked to predict and understand that risk and prepare for it in various ways. They are Kristy Senatori, the Executive Director of the Cape Cod Commission, Stephen Bourne, Project Director at Atkins North America, and Shannon Carroll, who is AT&T's Director of Global Environmental Sustainability. So with a big welcome to our panelists and a thank you to all of those who have joined us, let's get into the discussion. I thought we'd start by setting the stage a little bit here. Could each of you help us understand how your organization thinks about climate change? How big a risk is this? And specifically, what is it risks? Shannon, do you mind starting us off?
Sure. At AT&T, we take a very holistic view of climate change. We're looking at both the mitigation side, right? How do we reduce our own footprint, as well as how do we reduce our customers' footprint as well. We're also looking at the adaptation side, which is how do you prepare for the inevitable impacts of climate change that we will experience. So we're looking at both of those. This is obviously a material issue for us. Severe weather events impact us in a very real way. We have a significant network infrastructure, and we also have buildings located, throughout the United States. So again, just a very holistic view, looking at both sides of the equation, making sure we're not missing anything.
Great. Stephen, do you want to tell us a little bit about Atkins and the work you're doing to understand climate risk?
Sure, yeah. Our clients are typically municipal entities like cities, and they range up, up to federal as well, state level and so on. But, a large part of our focus has been on cities and how can we help them with understanding what climate change is going to do over the next few decades. We tell them, there are three things you got to do. You have to, get the information, work together, and think outside the box. Now, we consider ourselves as a trusted advisor of many cities, the entity that will get them the information, and I'll talk about a tool we have called City Simulator, which is specifically designed to do that and sort of stress test each city and understand what its resilience is right now and what its resilience could be if actions are taken in the future.
Great. Look forward to hearing a little bit more about that. Kristy, do you mind talking about the Cape Cod Commission and what climate change means to your area?
Absolutely. So on Cape Cod, the attribute that fuels our economy is our coastal community. And this is also what makes us vulnerable. Climate change is one of the most significant challenges that we face as a region. We have significant flooding, erosion, and other impacts that are occurring now. And we know that this will only be exacerbated by sea level rise and changing and increasing storm frequency and intensity. Under existing conditions, flooding actually threatens about 19% of our region's landmass. And this has a combined assessed value of more than $16 billion. So how we address our region's resiliency to climate change and coastal vulnerabilities is imperative and something that we must be addressing now. So a lot of the work that we've been doing is really focused on this significant regional challenge.
That's really interesting. So a broad group of perspectives there from business asset to communities. So it'll be interesting to explore some of those themes as we go. I thought we'd spend a few minutes up front getting a sense of how each of you has approached the challenge so far. And I guess the big question at the top is, how do you begin to get your head around a challenge that is emerging, changing, and is going to last for several decades? Maybe each of you could tell us a little bit about the techniques you've used to understand and predict climate risk, and then bring in the location element of that. Why does location matter to all of this. Kristy, why don't we start with you, if you don't mind?
Definitely. So, of course, we all use data and information to collect as much information about our emergencies as possible. So, for example, with our resiliency initiative, we have been collecting and updating LiDAR data, aerial flyover imagery, planimetric data to make sure that we have the most updated information for our communities as they look to plan for these vulnerabilities. Cape Cod is comprised of 15 towns and 15 communities, and they each have separate and distinct challenges and priorities. While we have one coastline, they are 15 unique communities. And so using the best available data and information wherever possible, we recognize that those nuances from community to community are important, and maps can help us illustrate what's at risk.
Stephen, how about you? What techniques is Atkins using to understand climate risk?
Yeah, we're doing some pretty exciting stuff in this area. The city simulator tool I mentioned, it's sort of founded on an idea that a city is a complex system of systems. You know, transportation system, building stock, social systems, natural systems, they're all together. And if you're really going to understand how resilient your city is and how resilient it will be over the next 3-4 decades as climate changes, what you have to do is simulate your city and all of its systems together, evolving over that time frame. So that's literally what City Simulator does. It goes day by day and evolves the city, including land development, including we have, it's agent-based. So if you have 1 million people in your city, there are 1 million avatars in this model moving around and doing things. And we also simulate using state-of-the-art climate models, storms, heat waves, drought, all these disasters. Recently, we actually added pandemics as well. We simulate all that happening over the next 30 or 40 years and measure exactly how resilient the city is. And the measurements get really specific, how many people are disrupted from getting to work on a daily basis. How much damage is there to buildings from flood, all that information, it's generating all of that. And it becomes the basis for decision making in terms of how a city will adapt and mitigate.
That's really interesting. Shannon, how about the AT&T perspective? I guess there's some simulation of another type going on there, but can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. The first thing you have to do is your homework, quite frankly, right? You have to figure out what climate impacts you're most susceptible to, because climate is not going to impact every person, every company the same way, and certainly not the same geography in the same way. So just trying to figure out what as a company we were most susceptible to, where's that risk, and then looking at the magnitude of that risk. What are the impacts, both physical and financial, quite frankly, to that risk? And so for us, what we did to address that is we built what we call the climate change analysis tool. We have lots of resources at AT&T. One thing, we are not our climate experts, so we went out and made sure that we got a hold of really good climate data. We worked with Argonne National Labs to do that. And essentially what we got is the best climate data we can get our hands on. We overlaid that into a mapping system, a GIS system that we currently have, and that just allowed us to then visualize the risk to different parts of our business, whether that's a retail store or the fiber that we're laying down.
So location is central to that, obviously, right? You had to figure this out
Absolutely.
in specific areas.
Absolutely. So you'll hear sometimes, statistics like, and again, just for example, the Eastern Seaboard is going to have X amount of sea level rise due to climate change, but that impacts Miami versus Savannah, Georgia versus New York City in very different ways. So the geographical part is very important.
Got it. Okay, well, let's explore that a little bit. And the data thing too, that's an interesting aspect we'll come back to. So obviously these techniques you're talking about involve some powerful technology in the background. Maybe we can spend a few minutes discussing specifically how technology has helped these efforts and helped you understand climate risk. Actually, Shannon, do you mind if we go back to you and start off?
Sure. Our technology solution is pretty straightforward. Again, and this is, tackling, again, the adaptation side, right? Preparing for the future impacts of climate change. Just expanding on what I was saying earlier, it is about getting, first of all, really good data, the best data that you can get. And so that's the climate data, right? And for us at AT&T, we're looking at climate risk specific to the Southeast. As we started this project, we wanted to make sure that we kind of crawled before we walked. We took a pilot approach and So the Southeast is particularly susceptible to climate change risks. And for us, again, it's using that data, overlapping it into a good mapping system, a good GIS system, because if you bring this data to people just in a practical nature, you just can't send them spreadsheets, right? That says location X is going to have X amount of flooding. You need to show them. So what we've been able to do with our climate change analysis tool is actually show the technicians, show the planners, based on what their responsibilities are. They can click on any part of that map, and they can not only see, you know, the physical things that they're responsible for, everything again from a central office to a retail store, but they can also see now what the climate impacts are to that physical location. So that's really how we've tackled the technology component.
That's really interesting. And Kristy, you've got a perspective from a different part of the country and maybe some different risks, but can you tell us a little bit about the technology aspect of the work you did there?
Definitely. So a couple of years ago, we received a grant from NOAA, and we worked with several partners, and it was a dedicated effort to focus on those critical impacts of climate change. And so we identified strategies that our local communities could use to adapt and mitigate some of those impacts. And so as part of that process, we developed an online decision support tool. It's our Cape Cod Coastal Planner tool. It's a decision support tool developed. Really, the key aspect of the functionality of the tool, it allows for consideration of the impacts of action, the impacts of inaction on both the natural and built systems in the region. So what the planner actually does is it allows a user to visualize the projected impacts of various levels of sea level rise. It looks at storm surge and erosion, and it can allow a user to impose certain potential adaptation scenarios that might limit some of these impacts. So it has outputs that the user can use to compare some of those various strategies and determine on their own what might be more appropriate for each of these local communities, so that they can better understand some of those impacts and the strategies might have on their local built, natural, and community systems, as we know they're all related.
So it sounds like a group of technologies, I'd say, kind of coming together to make some of this prediction palatable, visual, understandable. Can you talk specifically about the geographic technology that's involved? We've heard a lot of companies that are using some GIS technology, geographic information system technology, that they've traditionally used for other aspects of their business, you know, to plan a market, to understand how their sales are going across the country or the world. But a lot are beginning to bring that into this kind of climate analysis. I wonder if you can each just share a little bit of perspective on how that technology came to bear here. Stephen, do you want to start off?
Sure, yeah. We understood right from the beginning that GIS really had to be a part of our tool, our city simulator. So it is, in fact, an extension to Esri's ArcMap program. So if you have ArcMap and you have understanding of how to use ArcMap, you can dive right in with City Simulator. And the thing that I think you know, really sets it apart, though, is that unlike, you know, the map making of, you know, years past that you did with GIS, the City Simulator is actually written to visualize the simulation as it marches forward in time over a 40-year time frame. So if a hurricane hits your Florida coastal town, you actually see all the buildings popping up that are damaged, and you see all the roads popping up that are getting flooded by tidal flooding year by year by year. And it's, you know, doing calculations in the background. Like if you own like the dry cleaner that's on one of those roads, it's actually measuring how much business you're losing as a dry cleaner because of tidal flooding. You know, that kind of information. But we knew right from the beginning that we had to visualize this simulation because it makes it visceral, and it sort of moves the needle and results in action. Presenting it as a report, you know, or even a static map sometimes doesn't do it, but having that animation, it really has an effect.
That's interesting technology. Shannon, you have a broad area to look after, especially when you're talking about 4 states. How did that technology help you understand the risk?
So again, what we do is, you know, so when you're looking at those 4 states, again, you're going to look at what climate impacts are specific to those 4 states. So for us, you know, we're looking at flooding both inland and coastal. We're looking at high intensity winds as well, both hurricane and non-hurricane related. So when you think about what it takes to support a network, for example, you know, those 2 things are very important. But there's multiple parts of the business that are impacted by this, right? So when we do this, we talk to our supply chain folks, we talk to our corporate real estate folks, we talk to the network planning team. So all those folks that, you know, not only have responsibility for the physical things on the ground today that they have to, you know, maintain, but also those folks who are looking to, you know, put, you know, the next generation of network technology in the ground. So, you know, for us, again, it's looking at all those different components. It's using the best technology that you have available, and just, again, going off what was previously said, that the visualization is huge, right? So AT&T was actually already using a GIS platform. And so we just took advantage of that, right? We gave it additional functionality, and we were very fortunate that we were able to do that. We had a good GIS tool that could do that. So as you put that additional functionality in there, it just brings everything to life, right? Because again, you can send all the reports in the world, but until you see it right in front of your face, it's just a different impact.
Interesting. Kristy, can you share your thoughts on that?
Sure, and I just want to echo those sentiments that certainly putting it, the data and information in a map-based format that's visually appealing to an audience is the most critical component of this. So for our purposes, when we created the coastal planner, it was important to have data on both the built and natural systems and natural environment on the Cape. And so we could take a look at some of the projected impacts of climate change, such as flooding, storm surge, and erosion. And as part of the development of the tool, we had our GIS department, our development team, working diligently to develop a data layer called, which we call our vulnerability ribbon. So this was actually based off of the South Carolina Beachfront Vulnerability Index. And so it really gave us an opportunity to define on our own as a region certain segments of coastline, and we actually based these on the literal cell of shoreline in the region. And we were able to color code those to better visualize the areas that are either highly or moderately vulnerable to some of those significant impacts. So we worked with a number of data sets and data sources from across the region, from some of the federal agencies as well as local agencies, some of the nonprofit institutions around here that had the best available data and information, so that we could gather that and make sure that that was included as part of the online decision support tool. And so, of course, that's never completed, and we always are continuing to identify areas where we want to make improvements to that tool based on new and available information as we come across that.
Got it. So actually, that's a good segue to a little bit more of a discussion on data. You've all alluded to it. Kristy, that was a good explanation of where you're finding your data. Stephen, Shannon, I wonder if you can give us a deeper sense of what it was like to find the data. It's not always data you have, as you mentioned earlier, Shannon. So what was that process like of finding the right data to understand the conditions that were on the ground now and were coming from climate risk? And then maybe any tactical advice you have on sources that people can use if they're doing this on their own. Steve, do you want to start off? I've mentioned.
Sure.
Data. Yeah.
Yeah, so as you can imagine, you know, our model requires a lot of data. You know, we are simulating climate, and so we need results from global climate models that give us a forecast of rainfall, temperature, those kind of variables. We also need historic versions of those variables in the location of interest to do a process called downscaling, where we, you know, create sort of a localized daily forecast for storms, for example. We also need, you know, building stock information, that's parcels and zoning, you know, that kind of data. We need transportation information. So we need the road network and so on. We need data from the census as well, because, you know, we're stocking this digital town with, you know, avatars that represent the real population. So, you know, what we do a lot of the time, there's sort of a strategy you have to take in getting all this data. And what we do is focus on data sets that are actively maintained, and maintainers of those data sets have motivation to do so. So for instance, parcels, for example, we're mostly interested in the tax assessor's parcel databases. They have high motivation to keep those databases accurate. So that's the data we pull down. We also understand that it's a lot of work to really get these data in order to build one of these models. So we've used as many APIs as we can, and we tap into organizations like NOAA and USGS and the US Census to pull the data down automatically from within the tool. So all you really have to do is say, I'm interested in this town, and it'll get the data for you. which becomes very helpful and speeds up the process of building your model.
Good perspective. Shannon, you had a lot of data to gather here. You mentioned an Argonne partnership. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the process was like?
Sure. Very early on, we realized, we're going to need good quality climate data. And there is a lot out there. I think the challenge that we had is, how usable is that for what you're trying to accomplish? And for us, trying to get a lot of, what I'd call hyperlocal data that we can put into an existing GIS, was a challenge. A lot of the climate models that you see out there, they're 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers, they're grid cell, right? The view that they're looking at. So they'll give you a flooding statistic that covers that 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers. Working with Argonne and very closely and giving them very specific information in terms of where our assets are located, we're able to get that down to 200 meters by 200 meters. Which is really good, and we're trying to get even better than that. So what that allows you to do is then get a neighborhood view that's very useful, say, to a technician or again a network planner. So again, if I go to a network planner and I say, here's this climate change data point for flooding, but it covers let's just say 100 kilometers, even 12 kilometers. That's just not enough for them. That's not specific enough. But if you can say, hey, within 200 meters, this is the data point we're going to use. Now they can use that to make some decisions. Now they can say, okay, well, here's what I have within that 200 meter grid cell. And, here how susceptible it is to flood. And then now what actions do I have to take to kind of adapt that and make it more resilient to climate change? So it's really about getting the data that's out there and then making it specific for your needs.
It's a really interesting connection between something that to a lot of people is massive and diffuse, this idea of climate change, and connecting it down to a very local level. So that's an interesting exercise. I wonder if we maybe switch gears. We've talked about technology, talked about data. What about people? Any advice from you on who should be involved in an effort like this? Obviously, we've got different constituents here. We've got communities, clients, and then business owners. But if you were to form a team to figure out climate risk for an organization, who do you think should be on that? And any tactical advice on collaboration that you've learned from your efforts? Kristy, do you want to start?
Sure. So understanding and planning for climate-related risks, I think, involves a significant stakeholder involvement. Like I mentioned before, we have 15 communities, and they all have their own distinct challenges and priorities and strategies for addressing some of their risks more locally based on their own community character. And so throughout a lot of our planning processes, we have made a concerted effort to engage a wide range of stakeholders from all sectors. So for example, we include municipal staff, elected officials. We have the business community engaged, the real estate community, environmental groups, coastal geologists and engineers, as well as your general average interested citizens. And so trying to make sure that the information can be shared at all levels of engagement is critical to making sure that some of these projects are successful. So also as part of our Resilient Cape Cod project, we had a group of stakeholders that followed us through the development of our online decision support tool. And it was imperative for us to find out what type of information would be useful for them as they make some of these more local decisions. So they were really instrumental in helping us develop some of those tools. We've also had a group also working on the functionality piece of it so that they could anticipate how the tool would be used in the local setting once it was completed. So the involvement at the early on stages of more of the population and more of the stakeholders that would be impacted by these types of decisions was important. And I think this resulted in a better process, a better product, and one that we could be more confident was actually going to be used once we completed it.
Good perspective. Stephen, what did it look like in your world at Atkins?
Yeah, with our applications of City Simulator, everyone has to be involved if you want a short answer. It's very much a stakeholder-driven process. We refer to it as a shared vision planning. And if City Simulator is a decision support tool, and the rules of the decision support tools are that it has to be relevant, valid, and accurate. So if you don't include all the stakeholders that need to consider decisions that are being made right from the beginning, you know, it's not considered relevant or valid simply because you haven't included them. So, you know, we'll have, you know, our Atkins teams with scientists and engineers and so on, and they interact with the stakeholders right from the beginning. To echo Kristy's remark, that's pretty much the way we do it. Like we're building a tool together, and at the end of that process, if you've done it right, there's ownership of the tool among the stakeholders, and that's really what you're going for.
Got it. Got it. So it's probably good at the moment to back up a little bit. I steered us right into a discussion of prediction and risk, but there is certainly another side to climate change, which is how do we actually lessen its impact? And I wonder if we can talk for a minute about the actions that you're taking on that side of the equation. Shannon, there's certainly interesting things going on at AT&T. Do you mind giving us a perspective on that?
Absolutely. I appreciate the question. It's an important one. So we can, you know, strategize all day in terms of our adaptation strategies. But what are you doing to reduce your emissions, right? You kind of have to take care of your own backyard first. And, you know, we believe it's very important to do that. So, you know, what we've done at AT&T, we've set public commitments to reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions. I'm very happy to report that we are meeting all of those commitments. We've also recently set a science-based target, which I think is really important, because you want to be in line, right, with the international consensus on what it's going to take to, you know, mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. And for us, it even goes beyond, you know, minimizing our own impact. We're trying to figure out how do we minimize the impact of our customers as well. And we actually have a public goal right now. We call it our 10X goal. And the idea is that whatever our footprint is, we want to reduce our customers' footprint 10 times that, right? Just through our products and services and technology. So we're definitely committed to reducing our own footprint. I think you have to do it if you're talking about climate change. And then it's, you know, just going beyond what you do as well and looking at your entire value chain, whether that's your customers and supply chain as well.
Good. Kristy, you've mentioned some work perhaps in mapping emissions or things like that. Can you give us your perspective?
Yeah, certainly. And I think there's a lot of crossover between the adaptation and mitigation sides of climate impacts. And so we've actually been working on the mitigation side since we were created back in 1990, and just even looking at protecting open space and guiding growth and development in our region to more of the centers of activity, encouraging alternative modes of transportation and travel in the region. But when we recently updated our regional policy plan in 2018, we identified a number of actions that we needed to take to encourage our communities to better understand our regional greenhouse gas emissions. And so we have undertaken the development of a baseline greenhouse gas emissions inventory for our region, and we should be completed with that hopefully within the next month or two. But really using some of the models across the country, we've developed a methodology for the region that's specific to Cape Cod. And so we'll be looking to establish our own goals and objectives for the region. Once we have this baseline, it was really imperative that we start with the baseline data set so that we can actually build from there and we understand what our emissions are if we do want to set reduction goals as a region. We're also looking at a comprehensive GIS screening analysis for potential electric vehicle charging stations, and also looking at the development of utility scale solar arrays, energy storage, siting facilities. So going back to your initial question around location intelligence, it's critical to these each of these analyses and looking at siting of some of these important climate change mitigation measures. So it's our intention too to make the greenhouse gas emissions inventory scalable so that at some point we'll be able to actually reach down into the town level. So that as land use changes over time, we're a regional planning agency, we can track that. There's got that significant geographic component, and we'll be able to measure our progress in reducing some of our emissions over time.
Good. Stephen, how about Atkins? What happens on the other side of the coin at Atkins?
Yeah, well, you know, that's probably one of the best things about our city simulator is that you have a menu of mitigation and adaptation actions you can actually add to the map as, you know, your plan for resilience building. And, you know, these can include elevating homes to protect them from flooding, buyout programs, adding seawalls, In terms of pandemics, you can add social distancing, you can add, stay-at-home orders. Basically any of the disasters on our menu. There's a menu of options that you can choose to add as a scenario to your city, and sort of watch the simulation happen with them in place. And what you can do at the end is compare, the important metrics to you, things like lost productivity, storm damage, those kind of metrics, number of cases of that epidemic, those kind of metrics you can compare between, your base run where you did nothing to mitigate and this new scenario. Using this information, you can start to compare, what's the return on investment of different mitigation options, and that's how you really get the information about which way to move forward in the future.
And Chris, if I could, you just sparked something for me there in those comments, which is, we talked a little bit earlier about the importance of understanding what's the most material to you as a company in terms of the adaptation side, right? What are going to be the impacts to you as a company? I think, or county or whatever it is. I think the important thing to understand on the mitigation side too is, what's most material to you there, right? What are your greenhouse gas emissions mostly associated with, and focusing on that. So for example, AT&T, we use a lot of energy, so we went out and procured a lot of renewable energy. So, that type of strategy, if you have a big fleet, what are you going to do to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions? Because it's one thing to go out there and kind of play in this mitigation arena. It's a whole nother thing to do it in a way that's very material to you and has a major impact.
Stay with us, Shannon. If we get back to the question of mapping and kind of mapping out risk, I'm curious what some of the next steps are. Stephen, I think you give us a good perspective on what that means in the Atkins world, but in the AT&T world, once you've got the sense of what is coming for these 4 states, let's say in the next decades, what happens next?
So big question. I'll try to give you a concise answer. So first and foremost is just using the data, right? And we're in the process of doing that now. It's we're a big company with lots of different business units, parts of the business. So we're still communicating to all the different parts of the business that this tool is there. It's there for you to use on a regular basis. I'm going in and I'm training people on how to use that, how to get access to it. So it's just using the data that you have. Quite frankly, is a lot of it. And then you have to be humble in your approach. Our position is to provide that data and then let the experts do something with that data. So I'm not a network planning engineer, so I'm going to provide that data to them and let them make good decisions. I don't work in corporate real estate, but I'm going to provide that data to them and let them make good decisions because they're the experts. And then it's how do you expand and how do you do more? We're actively looking at how to expand the tool, and just, not expanding it in the exact same way that we've done it. So again, we talked about the geographical component because it's so important, but as you expand that tool, does that mean you look at different climate impact areas? And, the answer is yes. So it's doing it that way, doing it smart and strategic, looking to use the information that you have in the best way possible, and then looking to expand it and, learn from some of the things that you have learned from using the tool. And again, just making the best tool possible as you go forward.
Yeah. Kristy, if you think about resilience, Cape Cod certainly needs to build its resistance. What are some of the actions you take after you understand the risk better?
Well, as part of the development of the online decision support tool, we have a matrix of different types of strategies that communities can adopt. And so they run a fairly broad spectrum. And of course, we see some that are more well-established than others, and our communities are more likely to use some of these strategies than others. But what it's doing is actually we're having the conversation at the local level. We're allowing our communities to visualize some of the vulnerabilities of sea level rise and some of the threats that we face as a region, so that they're able to recognize some of the trade-offs of some of the solutions. And so it's important for the economic components of any of these resilience strategies really to be addressed as well. And so we're seeing a lot of our communities actually looking at some of the co-benefits of some of these solutions. And nature-based solutions may not always be appropriate in some situations, but making sure that there's a conversation around what type of adaptation strategy or mitigation strategy is most appropriate in these areas is important. And we're really seeing some progress in our communities in addressing some of these issues.
Okay. Well, this is meant to be a quick one. If you guys have a succinct answer to this one, I'm curious if during all your project work and your predictive work, if anything has jumped out at you as a surprise in terms of climate risk. in various locations. Stephen, does anything come to mind?
Yeah. Actually, just our last question about mitigation. One big surprise we get is the indirect solutions that pop out. An example is one of our first applications was a coastal town in the Dominican Republic. And what we found was that they had built their CBD, Central Business District, in the floodplain, essentially. And so we said, well, what if we, increase the ability of the telecommunication system throughout the town, like just bump it up, fiber optic, make it as good as it could be, so that we reduce the number of people who are actually going to the Central Business District, increase teleworking. The end result was that, all of the damage and disruption that flooding was causing started to decrease, not because the floods weren't happening, but we had pulled people away from the place where they were happening. So solutions like that, indirect solutions, which I mentioned, think outside the box. If you sort of take a step back and try something different, often that produces results that are, surprising and valuable.
Kristy, did anything surprise you?
I think it's mostly the numbers. So when we started looking at our vulnerabilities as a region, I mentioned that number of the assessed value that we have in our floodplain. It's about $16 billion worth of assessed value. But Cape Cod is made up of a variety of historic fishing villages and historic community areas. And we actually have a lot of historic buildings on the Cape too. And a lot of those are in that flood hazard area. And so we looked at the number of historic structures that are actually inventoried, and there's about 1,500 structures in that special flood hazard area. And if you actually look at the number that are also uninventoried, it jumps to about 2,300. So just looking at some of those vulnerabilities and what really makes the Cape such a unique region, a lot of it's our history and a lot of it's our character. And so much of that has such an ability to be impacted if we don't take action.
Good. Shannon, just a quick one, if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. I think what surprised us most is just how precise you can get the data, right? Again, as you go out there and look at the global models, they cover big swaths of area. However, with a little bit of time and effort, you can get that down to the neighborhood level. And that really does matter because, we have lots of information on this on a public white paper that we issued. But, even within one community, the way the sea level rise is going to impact the coastline, even within, several hundred meters, varies, right? So just how precise you can get that down to the neighborhood level if you put the time and effort into it.
Yeah, good perspective. Maybe a last question. I'm curious, you're all immersed in this challenge and understanding the risk of climate change. Given all that you've done, all that you've seen, what makes you hopeful for the future? Stephen, do you want to start off?
Sure, yeah. I think people and technology. Everyone is interested in climate change, and the communities out there really want to do something about it. I've worked in South Florida for many years. The communities down there, despite sort of political back and forth, they've just decided they are going to make a difference, and they've created their own compact, and that's been going for years. And it's very inspiring to go down there. The other thing is technology. We have to understand uncertainty in our forecasts. And, it takes 20 minutes to run 40 years for one town for one realization of the future climate. But what we actually have to run is 1,000 realizations to understand the uncertainty in all the variables. As cloud technology expands and as processors get faster, we're able to do that very, very quickly now. And as it gets more and more powerful, we'll be able to answer even more and more detailed questions.
Good. Shannon, are you hopeful?
Very hopeful. I think compared to a decade ago, looking at how many companies, municipalities are looking at climate change, again, is the biggest source of hope. I mean, every single day, and we all get our news feeds in, there's a new company, a new city, a new government agency. Somebody's looking at climate change in a unique and different way. And there are some things where, you get in danger of too many cooks in the kitchen. This is not one of them. Collaboration is key, and as many folks participating as possible, you're going to get the best result. And I'm very hopeful, based on what we've seen over the last few years.
How about you, Kristy?
I'm hopeful because I feel like Massachusetts and Cape Cod specifically are taking climate change very seriously, as they should be. Our towns here are taking advantage of funding opportunities, and they're getting projects built and designed, and there's really broad community support for addressing our environment and our climate change impacts. We have really strong partnerships with our local communities, with our state administration, with our nonprofits, with those that are working on the front lines to really address some of these impacts. And I think we have a lot to learn from other areas around the country. And I think Cape Cod as a region is serious about making sure that we're resilient in 15 communities. So I'm hopeful that we'll continue to make some progress in addressing some of our greatest regional challenges.
That's good to hear. Uplifting thoughts, and we certainly wish you all well on your efforts. It's great work. Obviously, this is a big issue, climate resilience, climate risk. They're major challenges, but I think our panelists today have done a great job bringing it down to earth a little bit, talking about the actions that they've taken and giving us some insight that we don't always get to hear. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this great discussion, and we'll have to pick it there. But of course, the issue is going to persist, and we're going to stay focused on it. I know our panelists are. In particular, the Esri blog, WhereNext magazine, and the Esri and the Science of Where podcast are launching a Climate of Change series, where we're going to focus on these topics in much more depth. You can actually already find a great story on AT&T's work that's coming up on WhereNext magazine, and a Cape Cod Commission is featured on the Esri blog. So take a look at those channels in the weeks and months ahead for more stories. In the meantime, I want to say a hearty thank you to Kristy Senatori of the Cape Cod Commission, Stephen Bourne of Atkins North America, and Shannon Carroll of AT&T for taking the time to talk with us, to share your insight, and to talk about the work that you're doing. Thank you all for joining us for Esri and WhereNext magazine. I'm Chris Chiappinelli. We'll see you next time.